Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session. My name is Maroon. I'm the VP of Operations at Farhat Accounting Lectures, and I'm here to discuss SOC reports using the carve-out method and the inclusive method. Now, in the prior sessions, Professor Farhat explained the difference between SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC 3 reports, and he also explained the difference between Type 1, Type 2 reports, in addition to the difference between the carve-out method and the inclusive method. So if you haven't watched the previous lectures, please do before this one, because in this session, we'll be discussing the additional information needed in a sample of SOC reports when there are required complementary service organizations and required complementary user entity controls. So we're not going to go over each detail in the report again. We're only going to be highlighting the differences with the standard SOC reports. So it's important to go over the information that was presented earlier in our previous sessions, because we're building upon your knowledge of the mentioned topics and specifically your familiarity with the sections in the standard SOC 1 and SOC 2 reports. Let's go ahead and get started.
Before we proceed any further, I have a public announcement about my company, farhatlectures.com.
Farhat Accounting Lectures is a supplemental educational tool that's going to help you with your CPA exam preparation as well as your accounting courses. My CPA material is aligned with your CPA review course such as Becker, Roger, Wiley, Gleam, Miles. My accounting courses are aligned with your accounting courses, broken down by chapter and topics. My resources consist of lectures, multiple choice questions, true-false questions, as well as exercises. Go ahead, start your free trial today.
Our first sample report is a SOC 1 Type 2 report. And as a quick reminder, the SOC 1 Type 2 report evaluates both the suitability of the design and the operating effectiveness of service organizations' controls over financial reporting. We're assuming that the carve-out method is being used for the subservice organization and that required complementary user entity controls are in place. So we have two assumptions here, and we're going to see their effect on the standard SOC 1 Type 2 report. You should already know by now that the first section of the standard SOC 1 Type 2 report is the scope paragraph. At the beginning of this paragraph, there's no difference. When using the carve-out method, we're still going to examine only the service organization description of its system, and we're not going to include the subservice organization system. Now, because we have required complementary subservice organization controls, we're going to add an additional paragraph mentioning the existence of the subservice organization. So here in this case, KLM uses data safe storage code. This is the name of the subservice organization to provide whatever services it's providing. The description includes only the control objectives and related controls of KLM service organization. It excludes the control objectives and related controls of the subservice organization. So this is how we know that we're using the carve-out method. The description of the subservice organization does not include the control objectives and related controls of the subservice organization, versus the inclusive method, where we're going to see later, it's going to be included. The description indicates also that certain control objectives can be achieved only if complementary service organization controls assumed in the design of the service organization controls are suitably designed and operating effectively. So even though the controls of the subservice organization are excluded from the description, it doesn't mean that they are not required or they are not important for the functioning or the achievement of the control objectives. They are still important, but however, they have been carved out, and the auditor's examination did not extend to controls of the subservice organization. We have not evaluated the suitability of the design nor operating effectiveness. So it's also very important to specify that our responsibilities as auditors did not extend to the controls of the subservice organization. So two key points here. The control objectives and related controls of the subservice organization have been excluded, and the auditor's examination also did not include it carved out the subservice organization controls. This is how we know that the carve-out method has been used and not the inclusive method. Now, for the next paragraph, it has nothing to do with whether we're applying the carve-out method or the inclusive method. It relates to the required complementary user entity control. So we have to mention that the control or certain control objectives outlined in the description can be achieved only if complementary user entity controls assumed in the design are suitably designed and operating effective. So the control objectives of the service organization will not be achieved without the complementary user entity controls being working effectively. We have to mention this fact. And also, we always mention that our examination did not extend to such complementary user entity controls. Regardless of the method applied again, we cannot extend our examination to the user entity controls. Now imagine that the service organization has 100 user entity controls. Can we go over the controls and examine the controls of each of these 100 user organizations? That would be impossible. So as you're going to see later, even when we're using the inclusive method, we're always going to exclude the complementary user entity controls from our examination. And we're not going to evaluate the suitability and the design or operating effectiveness of such complementary user entity controls. Now, the good news is that the next 4 sections of the report are the same as the ones that you would see in the standard SOC 1 Type 2 report. So the service organization and the service auditor's responsibilities, in addition to the inherent limitations and description of tests of controls, do not require any modifications because of the existence of the subservice organization and because of the required complementary user entity controls. Our next section is the opinion section. And for the first paragraph, there's no change because it deals with the fair presentation of the description of the service organization system. However, we have changes in the second and third paragraph of the opinion because the controls related to the control objectives stated in the description, they are suitably designed to provide reasonable assurance that the control objectives would be achieved if not only the controls of the service organization operated effectively throughout the period, but also if the subservice organization and user entities apply the complementary controls assumed in the design. So on their own, the controls of the service organization are not enough to achieve the objectives. That's why we have to mention in the second paragraph and in the third paragraph that deals with the operating effectiveness of the controls here, because we are dealing with a type 2 report. We also need the complementary service organization and the user entity controls to be working effectively in order to achieve the control objectives. Finally, the restricted use paragraph is no different than the standard SOC 1 report, and the service auditor would sign the report, mention the city and state, and date the report. Moving on to our second sample report, we're still dealing with the SOC 1 Type 2 report, but now using the exclusive method for subservice organization instead of the carve-out method, and we're still assuming we have required complementary user entity controls. Here, the change is going to start from the beginning, because we're not only examining the KLM service organization description, we're also examining the subservice organization description of its services, both of which are included in the description. They are not carved out, they are included. So whenever we're mentioning here the service organization, we also have to mention the subservice organization. And we have to explain the types of services provided by the subservice organization. And we have to mention that the service organization's description includes a description of the subservice organization's services. Again, whenever we're mentioning the service organization, we also have to mention the subservice organization. We have to be consistent in all the reports and mention them together, because we're examining both the service organization and the subservice organization's controls. The next paragraph is the same paragraph that we went over when we were dealing with the carve-out method. It's related to the required complementary user entity controls. So here, the inclusive method or the carve-out method are only for the subservice organization. They do not relate to the fact that you have required complementary user entity controls. So we're always going to mention the existence of these complementary user entity controls. And we're going to mention that we did not examine such complementary user entity controls. Next, we have the service organization's responsibilities. Here we have to amend it also to mention what? The subservice organization along with the service organization. We're being consistent in all the report. That's the only change that we have to make. Regarding the service auditor's responsibilities, the first two paragraphs, we don't have any change because here we didn't mention in those paragraphs the service organization. But whenever the service organization is mentioned, we need also to mention the subservice organization, and that's the only change to the service auditor's responsibilities. Regarding the inherent limitations, also same thing, because we mentioned the controls at the service organization, we have also to add to it the subservice organization. At the end, the same thing here. Regarding the description of tests of controls, there are no differences with the standard SOC 1 report. In the opinion section, we have changes from the beginning. Unlike the carve-out method, we are not only examining the service organization, but we're also examining the Omega subservice organization. So here, the description fairly presents the system and the subservice organization's services. They were designed and implemented throughout the period. The controls of the service organization and the subservice organization were suitably designed. And at the end, we have to mention also that the condition that if the controls operated effectively throughout the period and the user entities applied the complementary user entity controls. This sentence is the same as the sentence that we saw in the carve-out method report. Next, we're dealing with the operating effectiveness opinion, and we're also providing an opinion regarding the service organization and the subservice organization, and we're adding the same sentence related to the complementary user entity controls. Regarding the restricted use paragraph, there are no differences with the standard SOC 1 report. Next, we're going to be looking at the SOC 2 Type 2 report. What is a SOC 2 report? It is a report that evaluates the controls implemented by a service organization related to security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. Here we're assuming that we're using the carve-out method for subservice organization, and we still have required complementary user entity controls. Our first section is the scope section. There's no change to this section like the carve-out method for the SOC 1 Type 2 report. We don't have any changes because we are only examining the service organization and we're excluding the subservice organization. In the second paragraph of the scope, we have to mention that KLM, the service organization, is using a subservice organization. And we have to mention that they are required, they are necessary, along with the controls at the service organization to achieve the service commitments and system requirements based on the applicable trust services criteria. This language is relevant for the SOC 2 report. Now, how we can know for sure that this is a carve-out method report? The description does not disclose the actual controls at the subservice organization. They are carved out. And the examination of the auditor did not include services provided by the subservice organization. The other additional paragraph deals with the required complementary user entity controls. So we have to mention their existence, and we have to mention that our examination did not include such complementary user entity controls. The next four sections, like the SOC 1 Type 2 report, there are no differences regarding the responsibilities, inherent limitations, and description of test of controls. There are no differences with the standard SOC 2 report. Regarding the opinion section, also for the first paragraph, no changes. But in the second paragraph, we have to mention this condition that the controls stated in the description were suitably designed if its controls operated effectively and if the subservice organization and user entity controls or user entities applied the complementary controls assumed in the design. So we have to add those two conditions. We don't know if they were working effectively or no, but we have to mention that they are part of the internal control system and they cannot be disregarded. Same thing for the third paragraph, we have to mention their existence. We have to highlight that they need also to be operating effectively in order for the controls stated in the description also operate effectively. So the controls of the service organization depend on the controls at the subservice organization and the user entity. Regarding the restricted use paragraph, unlike the SOC 1 Type 2 reports, here we have a modification. So after mentioning the parties that the report is restricted to, we need to mention the knowledge that they should have. So they should have sufficient knowledge and understanding of the following. We need to add something here: complementary user entity controls and complementary service organization controls, and how those controls interact with the controls at the service organization to achieve the service organization service commitments and system requirements. So this is an additional understanding expected from those parties in order for them to be able to use the report. They should have this additional knowledge of the complementary user entity controls and complementary subservice organization controls. The rest of the section is the same as the standard report. And finally, no surprises here. Moving on to the SOC 2 Type 2 report, but using the inclusive method for the subservice organization instead of the carve-out method, and we're still assuming we have required complementary user entity controls. As you would expect, in the scope section, there are a lot of changes. So we have to mention that we're not only examining the service organization's description of its system, but we have also to include the subservice organization here. And we have to mention it everywhere we mention the service organization. So when we're mentioning the suitability of the design and operating effectiveness of controls, we're including the controls designed by the service organization and operated by the subservice organization. We're adding also two paragraphs to the scope section. One paragraph to mention the subservice organization and the services it provides, and to mention that the controls designed by the service organization and operated by the subservice organization are necessary for the service organization to achieve its service commitments and system requirements. And finally, in the last paragraph, we're mentioning the complementary user entity controls with the famous sentence that our examination did not include such complementary user entity controls. The next section is the service organization's responsibilities, and it's the same as the standard SOC 2 report. However, here there is a twist with the addition of a subservice organization responsibilities paragraph. So it's mentioned separately from the service organization's responsibilities. And what are the subservice organization's responsibilities? To provide an assertion about the description and the controls stated therein. It has the responsibility to prepare the portion of the description related to the services provided to the service organization and implementing, operating, and documenting controls designed by the service organization, which enable it to achieve its service commitments and system requirements. In the next three paragraphs, there are no changes to the service auditor's responsibilities, inherent limitations, and description of tests of controls. Next, in the opinion section, we have to make two modifications. One in the second paragraph to mention the complementary controls related to the user entities. And the same thing in the third paragraph also, you have to mention the complementary user entity controls. Finally, in the restricted use paragraph, we have to make the same modification that we did in the carve-out method report by mentioning that the related parties or the relevant parties need to have knowledge of the complementary user entity controls and the subservice organization controls, and the rest is the same. What should you do now? You should go to Farhat Lectures and look for additional resources to help you with your exam preparation. Thank you for watching and happy studying.